So this panel today on intermittent streams will focus on different habitat aspects, salmonid dynamics, and also ways that we can sense patterns of wet and dry as our Mediterranean climate varies between its very wet and very dry phases. So no one here, I think, needs convincing that drought is posing a threat to our already stressed aquatic ecosystems. And so I want to talk a little bit more about why to bring together science and local knowledge and citizen science around water and what this might add to our existing collaborations amongst agencies and universities. So understanding what residents are already measuring can give you insight into what matters to them. And so this could be fish, this could be springs, this could be aquifers where people's household water sources are drying up. And so as a scientist, looking at people's data and their water apparatus, so how they're storing water, how they're managing streams, reveals what they're doing to conserve water and cope with scarcity already. And so then there's an opportunity for policymakers to shape policies based on what people are already doing or extending that in a way that might make sense to them and they might be more on board with. And what I found through my dissertation research that took this very deeply transdisciplinary approach is that these joint research projects and analyses can create more robust results scientifically, and that these results can then be more applicable to regulatory processes and to restoration processes, because the research questions have really been shaped through dialogue. And so in my case, with National Marine Fisheries Service, DF&W somewhat, the RCD, and then with these local resident groups. And so what happens when watershed science encounters indigenous or local knowledge? Scientists may use data collected by non-scientists to improve models. And so there's some great research on the San Pedro River in terms of wet-dry mapping on this. Non-scientists who share data may develop shared concepts of hydroecological processes, and we heard a little bit about this earlier, where people having these transparent encounters come to understand how one another think, and then can think together a little bit more about these ecological drivers. So scientific and indigenous or local knowledges may harmonize, and so there's some nice research on Mountain Meadows by Jared Aldern and Ron Good and also others. But sometimes scientists may dismiss these knowledges because they're unreliable or non-scientific. Local knowledge holders may also withhold data because of concern about regulation, and this has been happening just this past year in Salmon Creek, where this threat of regulation from the state board has led people to deny access to for salmon and water monitoring. And so this one person I interviewed said, people are going to be less frank if they think there's any way the county or anyone else is going to monitor them. So there's potential advantages and also potential incommensurabilities. So in thinking about the coast, we've heard a lot about the Central Valley and the Sierra. The coast is really a different kettle of fish, if you were. So in thinking about scaling down and researching these local water relations, the particularities of these ecosystems are important. So many of these coastal watersheds lack big water, so there's not a lot of dams. The water sources are local and known, so people might have a municipal water system with high tariffs and breakdowns, similar to what we have in the Central Valley in a lot of places, or they may have their own well or spring that may dry up. And in this region, coho salmon went extinct locally in the late 1990s. In Salmon Creek, where I've been working, they were reintroduced in 2008 through the Russian River Captive Broodstock Program. And their future prospects really depend on local action to restore flow and habitat. And you can see examples of that in this slide. So there's some large rain tanks that are supplementing residential water use and replacing water withdrawn from streams and aquifers. And on the bottom, you can see this broodstock fish release in action in Lower Salmon Creek. So for those of you who don't know, Salmon Creek is just outside of the Russian River Basin, just south. It flows right into the Pacific Ocean. And it's mostly residential and agricultural land. These white lines are parcel boundaries, and you can see there's a very high demand for water from residential users. Each one of these is a straw into the aquifer that eventually takes water out of the stream. And it's a West Sonoma coastal community, very engaged community. It's also the site of the Birds movie, and you can see that local conservationists kind of build on this momentum to have nature walks where they show the real birds of Bodega. And so in these settled landscapes, human water use is intensifying stream intermittency. And we heard Peter Morrill talking about this earlier. And this has been documented by Matt Deitch and others in terms of large-scale diversions for grape growing, where we have a really sharp drop in water use when people turn on the pumps for frost protection. And what I've been looking at is this more diffuse effect of all of these little wells throughout the watershed, attenuating and intensifying the stream drying, the natural drying patterns. So thinking about intermittent streams, they're really driven by geomorphology. So on the top you have the winter state where you have continuous flow. You might have a regional clay or bedrock layer that's in the brown, and then there's gravel on top of that. So water's flowing through the hyporheic zone and over the surface. As that stream dries, you have the water table dropping so that these riffles become dry, and the stream then turns into a series of disconnected pools. And there's a lot of different biotic and abiotic effects. So we see cessation of invertebrate drift and declines in dissolved oxygen. So this is me snorkeling, counting steelhead. You'll see there's some steelhead that are going to come into the frame from the upper left. And so this is one of these pools. In the late summer, you can see there's a lot of organic matter in the pools. This pool's been disconnected. You can see a little steelhead right there. But the water's still clear, the fish are still swimming, the dissolved oxygen levels at this point are below 3 parts per million, and yet the fish are able to survive. And what we see is with extended intermittency, through microbial breakdown of these different leaves, we start to see these strange biofilms growing. And so we're starting to do some work on this kind of pinkish, what we think is a cyanobacteria that starts to bloom after the streams have been disconnected for more than 60 days. And so DO is around 0 at this point. And we're seeing no fish, no salmonids, no stickleback, very little animal life of any kind. And so our concern is that this is the new normal, and that in these extreme anoxic conditions, we're going from having, maybe 50% survival of juvenile salmonids to less than 10% over summer survival. And so building on these collaborations with local agencies and with the Watershed Council, I designed a study to look at the effect of this intensifying intermittency, and eventually to see, well, what could local residents do and local ranchers do to put more water in the stream in the late summer. And so just to throw a little data up here, some of you may have seen this at other recent meetings, but what we have here is on the x-axis we have June count, and on the y-axis we have October count. On the left panel we have pools where there was no October count, and so there was essentially no survival. On the right panel is all the pools where either coho or steelhead survived. And then the color is showing the level of dissolved oxygen in the pools at this time. And what you can see in this far right part of this plot is that coho and steelhead both survived in high numbers, relatively high numbers, in pools where dissolved oxygen was incredibly low, so down around 2 parts per million. And so this suggests that these intermittent streams are good refugia for salmonids, that these fish are evolved to live in these places, but that there's a threshold beyond which they all perish. And so if you look on the left, you can see a lot more of these really dark red colors showing that, well, it just got a little bit too anoxic for them, and this might be, maybe a week or two of flow that we're talking about. So it's a volume of water that's potentially within our power to put back in the stream if we manage water differently in the watershed. And then just a little bit more, this is a classification tree analysis, and the take-home message here is that salmon survive where dissolved oxygen is greater than 2 parts per million, water depth is greater than 0.4 meters, and volume is greater than about 5 cubic meters. So again, fairly small pools, but they need to be pools. They need to persist as wetted habitats through the summer. And so this leads us to think in terms of these sanctuary reaches. Again, Peter Morrill mentioned that there are these long-term refugia where salmonids might persist through the summer or through an extended period of drought. And these are very groundwater dependent systems. And so looking at this map in the lower right-hand corner, this is kind of looking at the groundwater recharge potential. And so we see all of these greenish blue areas are places where we can potentially infiltrate more water that will come out as springs and sustain these sanctuary reaches late in the fall. And this, in the lower left, is one such pool where a tiny trickling spring basically kept oxygen above that lethal threshold, and to the point where, this was in 2013, we had 63 salmonids surviving, which is pretty good for this stream. So thinking back to the citizen science, then, how can we use these results of this kind of academic study to inform monitoring and management? And so just looking at a kind of univariate regression, looking at days since pool disconnection on the x-axis and probability of survival on the y, we see that there's kind of this linear decline in the middle portion of that graph, and that, beyond 100 days of disconnection, we have very low survival. And so this led us to adopt this tactic of wet-dry mapping, where once a year during the driest time of year, volunteers, local residents and volunteers from the Watershed Council go out with GPS units and measure where the stream is wet and where it's dry. And this is something that has also been happening on the Russian River independently, and lately we've started to try to standardize our data collection and think about ways to visualize this on the web or in a web GIS. And so this is just one example of ways that this academic research can kind of feed back into citizen monitoring that can then generate data for management and perhaps for more research. So another possibility that I think is really interesting is there's a lot of local knowledge. And so this is just people keeping their own records for their own purposes. And this is Diane Misura tracking groundwater levels using this device of her own that she devised herself. That's a plastic water bottle on a string. And she's been measuring the level of groundwater for the last 20 years. And so we had a long correspondence about what's happening with this aquifer dynamic. And there's really quite a lot of detailed local knowledge of springs and wells that could potentially be used in these types of watershed planning processes. There's also quite a few people who walk the streams and look for fish. And they may not write their data down on data sheets, but sometimes they have these very elaborate records. And so this is Doug Hooper, and we were out counting spawning salmonids, and he actually worked for Fish and Wildlife back in the 70s, and so keeps these very detailed notes about the survival dynamics in these springs. And I think that this is a really crucial source of information to tap as we try to scale these efforts up or replicate them in different watersheds. And so thinking more broadly about what if these water sources are also habitat. So you can see here's a red-legged frog in a spring that is used for a water supply. And if we can change our way of thinking about water so that we're thinking about water for humans and for other species, and this is actually how people in this area think about their water sources. So instead of this conflict discourse that is really common, that food grows where water flows with water diverted from rivers, we have this very popular sticker from the Salmonid Restoration Federation that salmon grow where rivers flow, and we need to cultivate both fish and other kinds of food. And so just arguing, last slide, that these multi-species entanglements that I find in these places are a new way to balance. And so rather than these co-equal goals that are kind of separate, we can think about interdependence, where people see the water they use daily as entangled with other species and the watershed, and only able to arrive, be used, and recirculate as a result of interactions between these elements. So I'm going to end it there with this slide on the left of thinking about these so these are, on the left is streams that are dependent on hyperrheic flow. And so just thinking that this is maybe a shift away from thinking about the whole state as kind of a network of dams and aqueducts. And with that, I'll introduce the next speaker.